Do you feel as well as you look?
I feel fine, thank you. I feel fine.
That's great. We were talking backstage, and I think it might be interesting. We have some people who are here for the first time, some people who have been here several times. They all admire the service that you've done. I thought it'd be good to kick this off. If you could just take us back a few years. I pledged allegiance to Jimmy Carter in 1975. So we've known each other a long time. And both of us have been blessed to live far longer out of office than we were in office. And you realize, that you want every day of your life to count, to be a good experience. So I think it'd be good if you would start by telling all these people who are, by definition, a little newer to the service life than you are, how you decided to organize your life when you left the White House and to do what you did.
Well, thank you, Bill. Well, first of all, it didn't take me long to live longer after I left office than it did when I was in office. I was good at getting elected, but not good at getting reelected. But so I had a lot that I wanted to do when I left office, and so we decided to organize a Carter Center, and to kind of fill vacuums in the world. To look around the world and see what was not being done that we thought should be done. But if the United States government or Harvard University or the United Nations or WHO was doing something, we didn't get involved in it. And so that's what we started on. And so most of our work has been overseas. We take care of health programs. We monitor elections. We've just done over 100 elections. We try to promote peace and things like that. But one time I came back from Africa trip, and the president of Emory University, where I've been a professor now for 34 years, said, why don't you do something at home? Because we have a lot of poverty in Atlanta. So we did an analysis of Atlanta, and we found 500,000 people who lived in the southern part of Atlanta, a lot of them African Americans, who were living in periods of destitution. They couldn't get a job and so forth. And I was amazed at how many people we took on to help. But we divided them up into 20 different groups of 25,000 each. And we found when we went into those poor neighborhoods, which I hadn't been into much before, that the policemen and the welfare workers and health workers and school teachers didn't live there. They lived in a nicer part of town. They just commuted in and out of the very poor section. So we decided to organize the Atlanta Project. And it was one of the most interesting things we did, because I wanted to bring together higher education and business as well as government to help these very poor people who didn't know how to make out a grant application. So we did that, and for every 25,000 people, we got a major corporation to kind of adopt them. So Delta Airlines took 25,000, Coca-Cola took 25,000, and we had a major university do the same thing. So it turned out to be a very good program. We had it for 5 years, and I treated those people like they should have been treated to begin with. And I'd say at the end of 5 years, 16 of them graduated. They met our criteria, and the other 4 we helped for several more years. But it was a very interesting thing to see, like Delta Airlines helping, people who were very poor. And Delta Airlines, for instance, realized that when they put out a call for flight attendants, they would just publish it in the Atlanta Constitution newspaper, and none of those people ever read the Atlanta Constitution newspaper. So they learned how to advertise. And most of the very poor people that got welfare checks, they had to pay about $15 or 15% to cash their welfare checks. They couldn't get a chance to have a bank account. So we got the banks to let them have bank accounts. So it worked out a very good thing, and that's when we saw that in the United States as well as overseas, there's a very sharp division between rich and poor, and we try to cross that barrier between the rich and the poor. And that's one of the things the Carter Center did. So I had a handful of things to do, filling vacuums in the world. We still have a lot of vacuums that we still need to fill. I think CGI is filling a lot of them myself.
Let me ask you this. Explain to them what you did with river blindness and how do you keep a project going over a period of several years? Something that takes multiple years to do.
Well, for instance, just take guinea worm is one disease that we tackle. We started working on it 30 years ago. And we found it in 21 countries, 23,600 villages, 3.5 million cases. And we've been working on those people. There's no medicine for it. We'd have to teach them how to change their life so they won't have this worm growing in their body. And we've now cut it down. Last year we had 22 cases instead of 3.5 million. And this year, so far, we only have 2 cases. So we're working on getting rid of it. But I would say the main thing is to let the people do for themselves what they can do and what they have always been able to do. But a lot of these folks, particularly in Africa, have never known what it means to have success. They've never known what it means to trust somebody from outside that wanted to help them really. And we have found one of the most revealing things that I've found since I left the White House, and I knew it a little bit ahead of time, was that these poorest of people who's never had a decent house to live in and who's never had any success in life are just as smart as we are and just as ambitious as we are. Their family values are just as good as ours, and they work just as hard as we do if they're given a chance to work on something worthwhile. So that's one of the big lessons I've learned.
I love hearing it when you mention all these numbers. You know, people make fun of me when I talk about numbers. And I've always been amazed that politics is the only profession where people are surprised if you know anything. So I want you to give us all those numbers and statistics, because then it'll be harder for everybody else to ridicule me when I do it. Let's talk about a problem that you and I were talking about backstage. The American economy is different than it was when you served, different than it was when I served. The challenge is somewhat different. And we talked earlier about this huge problem of prescription drug and heroin abuse that's sweeping across the country. And a lot of it is rooted in the fact that so many people are stuck economically. If you were approaching this from a service point of view as opposed to being in political office, you got any ideas about what we can do about that, and about whether we can use service to help take this huge burden of accumulated college debt off the young people in this country? It's also a source of enormous frustration to them. A lot of them think they'll never be able to start their own business, never be able to go on with their lives, because they're never going to get the debt off their shoulders.
Well, I think a lot of the problems with the debt, to take that question up first, is because the colleges and universities have raised their tuition a lot. And the states that used to provide enough money to cover most of the cost have reduced their contribution. So this has meant that the students, in order to get through the colleges, had to accumulate debt, and they're still in debt. When I left office, we had a program going on with relative low tuition and good state support, where every qualified person could go to college. And I hope that we'll see that come back again. I know there's been discussion about universal college education, so I think that we need to come back with that again. But as far as the drug and the hopelessness is concerned, I believe that we need to change our policy on drug care. When I was in office, I made a public statement in 1979, I think it was in May, and called for the decriminalization of marijuana, not to let it be legal, but to decriminalize it, to stop putting people in prison because they possessed or used drugs. And so we concentrated then on treatment of people that had a drug addiction. That changed when I went out of office, as you probably know, and it's been changed ever since. But now there's an increasing number of people that want to change it back. And I think even both Democrats and Republicans now see that the heavy load in our prisons have become a counterproductive effort. When I was governor, this is ancient times, we had a competition with other governors in the South, at least, including Arkansas, as a matter of fact, to minimize the number of people in prison. In 1980, when I became in 1976, when I became president, 1 out of 1,000 Americans were in prison. Now, 7.5 times as many people are in prison as there were back then. And a lot of it is because of a incarceration of people that are taking drugs. But there, I think you have to get the person who's an addicted person, to be involved in his or her own correction and own salvation. And I think if you just target them to put them in prison and punish them because they own some marijuana, I think that's a kind of productive thing. So I think in every case, if you let people be involved in their own correcting a problem, own solution of a problem, that's the best approach to take.
You know, I think we were talking about this backstage. I cannot remember a time in recent history when there's been so much agreement between Republicans and Democrats, A, that the drug problem ought to be treated like a mental health and medical problem, and B, there are also a lot of cross-party agreement that spending $64,000 a year to keep somebody in the penitentiary is not as good as spending much less to prepare them to re-enter the workforce. But I do think that's where I'm going with this is we're going to need more people who are willing to have the kind of projects that we just announced for homeless people, for people moving from prisons into the workforce. We can't have people let out of prison and then have them discriminated against when they apply for jobs. And we have to have a pipeline where we train them for those jobs. And we need more people to, I think, to go into the prisons in the first place to do that. But I think, you know, I can't, in other words, the government can do what it ought to do to change the laws, but I think it's unrealistic given all these budget problems governments have to think that we will adequately prepare them. Although what you were saying about poor people, it's worth, New York, where Hillary and I live, has a very active prison program run by Bard College. They're in 11 prisons. One of their prison debate teams beat Harvard and West Point in the last 16 months. So that proves what he said. Intelligence is pretty equally distributed. If you were leaving the White House tomorrow and you had to design a service life, what would you do? How would you think about it?
You still talking about prisons?
Yeah, that's anything.
You know, I think we need some innovation that would involve not only the people who have been caught by the police and accused of a crime, but also the general public, the successful leaders in business and education. One of the things that I did, for instance, when I was governor that might be tried, we had a program of getting volunteer probation officers. And I was active in the Lions Club. I was a leader in the Lions Club. And so we called on all the members of Lions Club and Kiwanis and Rotary Club to volunteer to be probation officers. And we would bring the volunteers up here to Atlanta, and the prison director, Ellis McDougall, and I would give them instruction. And they had to agree, before they came up here, that each member of, say, a Lions Club would take one probationer. And they had to visit that prospective probationer before he got out of prison and get to know their families. And that prominent businessman had to promise me, as governor, that he would guarantee that that person, when they got out of prison, would have a job. And so, and then we gave them rudimentary instructions, and they became voluntary probation officers. But it not only let us keep the people from going back into prison because they had a job when they came out, but it also let the business community begin to learn in Georgia how much better it was to get somebody out of prison and constructive than to stay in prison and eventually become a hardened criminal. So that's a kind of innovative thing that we might try again.
It's a really good idea because we don't have enough probation officers to handle the people that are out there now, much less the people that ought to be let out.
It was the same way then. We didn't have enough probation officers. But that took a lot of burden off but they worked harmoniously with the probation officers. So these volunteers prominent business leaders would only have one probationer to be responsible for. They wanted to make darn sure that guy, had a job and didn't go back into prison. So it was a very personal relationship between the richest people in the community and the people who quite often a young black African-American young man that got out of prison. And he got a job and had a good life after that. That's the kind of thing that we need to try more of. And I think that the governors or the president himself or herself can very well inspire the people to do it.
That's all we need is another job. But no, I think this is good. Every one of you, wherever you're from, I'll bet you anything, wherever you're from, I'll bet you anything that the probation system in your state is inadequate to properly serve the number of probationers that exist today, much less the number we would have if we deinstitutionalize all these young people that have been sentenced for too long for nonviolent offenses. So this is a good idea. We didn't rehearse this. I just came to him. That was really good. So what else? If you weren't doing something in criminal justice and you were walking out of the White House today, what else would you do?
You make it. You got me answering all the questions, but I don't mind. As a matter of fact. Well,
they know what I think about everything. Right. I'm boring to them.
Well, let me take another problem that exists in our country, and that is the decreasing number of people who vote in America. And as you know, there are a lot of efforts, I would say, among Republican and Democratic legislatures. If they get all Democrats in the legislature, all Republicans, and the same governor from the same party, then what they want to do is to minimize any change in the electoral system. And I think that of course, most of it is on the opposite party bill. I see the expression in your face. This is something that Republicans are doing. But how do you get young people registered to vote? If I had my preference, I would let everybody be automatically registered to vote when they're 18 years old.
Yep.
But another idea that I tried, and it worked very well in Georgia, was we passed a law deputizing every high school principal to be a voting registrar. And every May, as governor, I called on the high schools to have a contest among every high school in Georgia about who could register the most upcoming 18-year-olds to be registered voters. So that was a way to do it. But when I got to the White House and tried a similar proposal, both Democrats and Republicans opposed it because they didn't want to change the constituency that had put them into Congress. So although we blame Republicans mostly for trying to keep African Americans and old people, and others from voting, poor people, I think both sides are kind of reluctant to change the constituency that has put them in office. So that's something that a president can speak to the people about and maybe get something like that done. But I think the main thing is to have last-minute registration and a registration by mail, or register everybody when they're 18, which I just said, or get high school principals to be registrars. There are kind of ideas that can be attractive and exciting.
Well, I agree with that, and I think we should have automatic enrollments and a lot of other things. I also think it would help if more states would adopt a system like California's for a sort of scientific drawing of legislative boundaries so that it became less political. And I'm saying, in California, there was a lot of opposition to this among Democrats because it's a heavily Democratic state, so they were more likely to put more seats at risk there. But it works better because then the candidates in more and more districts have to appeal to people across the board. But we got a different problem I was going to ask you about that I think is contributing to a lot of this polarization in America. And that is that two different Americas show up in presidential elections and midterm elections, much more than was the truth 40 years ago. That is, if you remember, you had a pretty good midterm right after you became president. but there wasn't the turnout was down, but it was uniformly down. That is, it always some drop off from a presidential race to another. But now it's breathtaking the difference, the demographic and political makeup between people who vote in presidential elections and who vote in midterm elections, which makes, you know, the Democrats suspect when we want to expand voting registration, and the Republicans suspect when they want to make it harder to vote because we think they're trying to make the presidential election look like the midterm election. And we need to come up with some system where citizen activists can get the midterm vote up. Because if the midterm vote, if the American profile were more or less united, I think it would help us pass immigration reform, for example. Because then both parties would have to commit. It'd be difficult over the long run for the Democrats. Both parties would have to compete for every demographic group. And I think that's important. So you got any bright idea? I don't. That's why I'm telling you, I failed. I fell on my face last time. I worked very hard in 2014 to try to bridge the turnout gap between presidential elections in my native state in Arkansas, and I failed. But I think if there's got to be a way we can do it.
Well, there is. I think the two dramatic changes that have taken place since you and I both ran for president is a stupid decision by the Supreme Court on Citizens United. And the other one is increasing gerrymandering of a congressional districts. And here, I think an enlightened Supreme Court could reverse both of those things. One of the things that would be very easy for maybe even a conservative Supreme Court to do was to say that every state had to have maybe a blue ribbon commission to outline congressional districts. I think that would go a long way to reducing the polarization, because now in Georgia, for instance, with a Republican legislature in power here for a long time and Republican governors, we have a division in Georgia because they want to put all the white people in one district and get all the African Americans in a different district. So the only possibility for a congressman to get elected is to live in an African American district and be African American. The rest of the districts are Republican. So that kind of division artificially of the state instead of a proper division, it would go a long way. So I think those two things would be the best thing. And plus universal registration. If we get those three things done, we'd have maybe a democratic system in America as good as it was when you and I were president.
Yeah, I think it's really important. It isn't healthy to be an elected representative of the people and realize you can never be defeated again unless somebody gets to the right of you if you're a Republican or to the left of you as a Democrat. It discourages people from working together, and I think it's not healthy.
But that's the way it is in this country. And California has corrected that to some degree.
I mean, I think, it's really interesting watching. I've seen, just since California changed the system, I've seen the change in the quality of the debate there, where it's still a heavily Democratic state, but there's an extraordinarily, they talk more about the practicalities of implementing progressive reforms there. People, they feel safe to talk about that it may not be as easy as it sounds. And that's a good thing. You don't want to create a system where people can't have an honest debate about what's really in their mind and heart without thinking they're going to be washed away because they're not perfect.
Well, another thing that we can do that I think would improve the situation is to go back to the presidential elections just using public funds for the general election. When as you know, and it applies to you too, when I ran against Gerald Ford, incumbent president, for the general election, we raised zero money. We took just a $1 per person checkup. I think it's increased now, and I think you probably did the same thing, did you not? But we need to go back to that. And I'd like to see, I would personally like to see public financing for all elections from Congress, the U.S. Senate, and governor and president. I think that would be a good move as well.
And now, of course, it would require, as you pointed out, a change in the Supreme Court decision, because you can't, you could say, well, you can't have this public money unless you follow restraints, but that was the rule before, and so much money could be raised, everybody just blew by it.
I really like 3 words you just used: change Supreme Court.
Yeah, it's important. We've seen some altogether unusual interpretations of the Constitution, I thought. Let me ask you something else that I think is important. Help us all to understand, you continue to travel the world, you're in very close touch with all the things that are going on. People were worried about a lot of the harsh rhetoric and rather extremely divisive things that are being said in America, but the truth is they're being mirrored everywhere in the world, where people either feel that, where they feel the combined impact of stagnant economics and kind of identity-threatening diversity crises. You got the biggest refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. You've got this lot of tension between China and their neighbors and Southeast Asia, because of the economics and nationalism there. You got a lot of candidates getting elected who are saying rather bizarre things, including the new president of the Philippines, who suggests that maybe journalists should be assassinated. What's your take on this? Why do you think it's happening worldwide? And what, if anything, can be done about it? And don't say anything about America. Just think about the rest of the world. It's just, this is going on everywhere. In Latin America, we think we're making progress against, there was a democratic change in Venezuela, then is it? And Brazil, of course, sadly, is in a turmoil. But these kinds of things are happening everywhere at the same time. So it isn't just America. So what's your take on what's caused it globally and what we should do about it?
Well, when the last of '99 and the first of 2000, I made 2 speeches. One was in Taiwan, the other was in Oslo. And they asked me to speak on my greatest concern about the next century, which when 2000 was coming along. And I said, my greatest concern about the next century is the increasing division between rich people and poor people. And not only between rich people and poor people in a country like China or the United States, but also between rich countries and poor countries. And I think that has become the most serious generic problem in the world now. A lot of people think that the world is more in conflict now. War is going on. As a matter of fact, we're at kind of a low level of total people in conflict right now compared to most of the time. But that division between rich and poor is becoming greater. And I think that causes a lot of polarization, and it causes people, like in our country, to take radical stands which appeal to the people that are left out. So one of the things that needs to be done for our people is also obviously to give them jobs and to give them a good education, but also to let the people feel like they are being treated fairly by their own government. And I think a lot of folks in the United States now don't feel 2 important things. One, we're being treated fairly by our government. And secondly, I believe that my children can have a better life than I have. We've lost that sense of optimism that each generation is going to be better off. So I think those 2 things have caused the radical nature of political campaigns, which you just asked me about, in other countries, and I think as well in this country.
If you look, by and large, the places that have more economic inequality and upward mobility, both, because they're both important, have less tension. Now, if less of these kinds of tensions, the only places where you see it, that I've seen it, where there's a slight exception, are in countries in Europe that feel particularly threatened by the refugee crisis. For example, that Austrian election was very close, between the candidates that said build walls and the candidates that said build bridges. And they have almost no inequality and a fair amount of upward mobility, but they still feel this identity crisis. Do you think that all this diversity we have in our country, in the end, will leave us better off in dealing with this?
I hope so. You know, I think there's going to be a reassessment in America by individual citizens and collectively after this election experience that we're involved in now. I think a lot of people feel not only alienated but kind of disgusted with some of the campaign rhetoric and the violation of human rights as a public proposal by major candidates. And that's something that I think is going to be corrected in the United States. What we need to do, in my opinion, is to look back at the only time in history when we've ever had I'd say a worldwide commitment to the basic moral and ethical principles that shape our great religions and that sort of thing. And that was at the end of the Second World War, where we formed the United Nations to prevent wars. And we had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to treat everybody fairly. We were pretty well abandoned both of those things, as you know. The United Nations now, the Security Council doesn't prevent wars, and even our own country is violating a lot of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights paragraphs. So those two things, I think, can be changed. And I believe that once we reach the bottom of political idealism and fairness and I'd say amnesty between both sides or amity or friendship, I think we're going to have a reaction against it, which I believe would make our country even better.
Do you think, that's it. What about the, let's talk a little about this. What about the Carter Foundation, the Carter Center, our foundation? We're non-state actors, not government, and we do things with government. You work very closely with governments. But ISIS is a non-state actor. One of the problems that I think is being presented to by all of the rise of conflict related to non-state actors is how to apply norms to them and dealing with them when, if every country in the world follows the same norms and they don't, more people may die. So I think that, is there some way, do you believe we should have some sort of international convention governing non-governmental organizations that non-state actors are big enough, strong enough? Heck, the Gates Foundation is bigger than a lot of countries now and then does a heck of a lot of good too in the world. I mean, have you ever given any thought to that about whether there should be some international standards governing what we do?
The Carter Center tries to have international standards on monitoring elections, and we've made a lot of progress in that respect. You know, some countries now are outlawing non-governmental organizations. We have been welcomed 15 or 20 years ago into a lot of countries, and now we find that we're no longer welcome in those countries because we've taken positions that the increasingly oppressive governments don't like. So I think that the more that the NGOs can work together in harmony and see where are our common goals and commitments, that would be very helpful. You know, I don't think you and I have ever sat down together to see how the CGI and the Carter Center might cooperate and maybe fill each other's gaps that we leave over and cooperate when we could. But I think if we could do that and get other organizations to come in with us, it might be good maybe for you and I to call for a meeting somewhere.
I agree with that. I know what you're saying about the governments too. Let me ask you just one other thing. I'll get off of this because I don't want it to be too political. But
You don't want to be what?
too political about this. But one of the things that bothers me is all these surveys which show that there's really not a lot of base level knowledge that you would normally take for granted among the electorates of many countries. People do know whether they're getting a fair deal or not. They're instinctive about that. But they don't necessarily know how their governmental system works or what the options are. Have we stopped doing a good job on civic education in schools? I remember it was a big deal when you couldn't get out of the 8th grade when I was a kid growing up, unless at least we had a really good civics teacher. And do you think we should do more with that? I mean, do you think that just without thinking about it, we've let that go?
You mean have more restraint about emotions, for instance?
No, yeah, basic civic education about how the system works.
Yeah.
How does the state government work? How does the federal government work? How are laws made? Why are midterm elections important? What is a foundation? What do they do? How does it relate to the rest of the government? I get the feeling that most students get all the way out of high school and never get really serious education in that.
That's true. You get out of universities too without it. I think that's true. And I agree with you that the average citizen ought to have a very, I'd say, interesting and exciting way to learn about their own government processes and what the relationship is, say, between the executive and legislative and judicial branches of government and what the principles are involved. You know, there's only one country in the world that can take the leadership in something like this, and that's our country. You know, I think we ought to be a superpower in every way, not just the strongest military and the most economic influence and cultural influence, but I think we ought to be the number one nation on earth working for peace. I think we've been to war, a conflict with other countries about 30 times since the Second World War. Other countries that are almost as powerful as ours very carefully avoid war. Since 1979, you know, China hasn't been in conflict with anybody. And I think the United States ought to be that way. That whenever somebody has a potential conflict in the country, they ought to say, why don't we go to Washington? Because the United States is for peace, always. I think we ought to be number one in human rights and number one in environmental protection. You know, and I'd say number one in generosity to people that need help around the world. We ought to be number one in admirable things so that other people will emulate and admire the United States as a true superpower in every way and not just because we're the strongest.
If you were... I agree with that. We actually have this, most people think, and one thing that our citizens don't know about, most people think we give 10 to 15% of the federal budget away in foreign aid. And these polls have not changed in 40 years. I've watched them. And in fact, we give, a very small percentage of the budget and
like a fourth of 1%, isn't it? Something like
a fourth of 1% of GDP, yeah. Maybe less, but only about 1 to 1.5% of the budget. And anything you could broadly construe is foreign assistance, and an enormous percentage of that, as you know, goes to the Middle East. And we justified it for a long time in the Cold War because we were essentially providing a defense umbrella over Europe, and in theory, they were giving a higher percentage of their GDP back to the world and the developing world in foreign assistance. But I think I think that one of the things that would do Americans a lot of good is to getting continuous updates in comparative performance of our country and others in areas like you said that measure good, positive things. Because our development programs can do a lot of good, but they're still nowhere near as generous in percentage terms as Norway's, for example. And the British, I have to defend. I've been very close to all the Labour prime ministers, but I got to give Prime Minister Cameron credit to one thing he refused, even after the crash, to do. Even after the financial crash, he refused to reduce the percentage of their GDP that was going to development assistance, and they deserve a lot of credit for that. Let me ask you something, since we're all talking about this, about what creates justice. How much do you think that people feeling the government doesn't treat them fairly in their incomes can be tied to the weakening of the union movement in America? And how much do you think is the inevitable result of our moving away from manufacturing toward a more service-oriented economy?
Well, I think the reason that most Americans feel they're not being treated fairly by the government is because they're not being treated fairly by the government.
So, say more.
Yeah, well, because, I'll say since I left the White House, every administration except one, yours, has reduced taxes on the richest people and not taken care of the middle class, which is almost now eliminated, and poor people. And I think that most of the breaks that come along are caused by the changes in Congress, because the lobbyists who are there putting constant pressure on Congress members and giving them money to run for re-election work for the big corporations and so forth. So I think that change and the tax structure and breaks by going overseas to get your income, those kind of things are having a very permeating adverse effect on our country, and it convinced the average person, I'm not getting a fair share. And I think that's accurate. So we need to change that, and I hope in the next administration we'll see it change.
But to be fair, I got to defend. I got to defend President Obama on this. His main bump on the upper income people in taxes was letting the cuts that were enacted under the Bush administration to the income tax rates that I established. You're right, we did raise them. But then upper income people also paid a health care tax, so that I know, because we did this last year in our family, I think the maximum rate now is about 43%, which is higher than it was when I left office because of health care. But the real problem is the absence of what Warren Buffett wants, which is the Buffett rule. That is, people whose incomes don't come primarily from ordinary income still have relatively very low taxes, which is why Buffett says everybody with an income of $1 million or more, whatever the source of it, should pay at least 30%. Now, that would have a big impact on tax fairness in America.
That's admirable that he's done that.
Yeah, really admirable. And I think, of course, he also wants to give his money away, too. That's further admirable.
Yeah, I agree.
He and Gates are finding out, because they're smart investors, it's harder to give their money away. They keep making more than they can give away. But they'll eventually, when they run out of the opportunity to make it, they'll be giving it all away. Anyway, I do think that tax fairness is important, but the real thing that's riddling it is all these tax shelters and giveaways and all that. That's why we need some very simple rules that say, okay, play all the games you want to, but if you make X amount, you have to pay this. They'll always outsmart us unless it's simple. On the way out here, we're about to run out of time. What would you say to the young people in the audience about how they should decide what service to do, when to do it, and what it's meant to you? I mean, I don't think there's any question that the service life you've lived since you left the White House is one of the reasons you look as good as you do, you feel as good as you do, you're in the shape you're in. I don't think there is any question. Proverbs are right about that. Happy heart doeth good like medicine. But suppose you were, what do you know now that you didn't know when you were 20 that you could say to these young people here?
Well, I've already mentioned one thing that I've learned, and that is that extremely poor people are underestimated by us, and they're just as good as we are. That's one thing that's very hard to say. And I think that I've learned that more in dealing with Habitat for Humanity than anything else, including the Carter Center, similar. But there, we just deal with people that never have had a decent home. We work side by side with them to build their own house. They pay full price for the house, but they don't pay any interest, and they repay the loans. And so that's a way to let people come up by their own bootstraps without feeling obligated to anybody else. But I think the main thing is to have a feeling that all of our Christian and I'd say other religions commitment tell us that everybody's equal in the eyes of God, and that we ought not to look down on anybody else. But I think in our country we still have an element of renewed understanding that we haven't solved, for instance, the race issue yet. When I was in office and when you were in office, we kind of had a feeling of relief that finally we had resolved the race issue because of good work of Martin Luther King Jr. and Andy Young and people like that. But now we've begun to see again that our African-American neighbors and others as well are treated unfairly. They don't get as good education. They don't get as good a job. They don't get as good job pay. They're the ones that fill up the jails, and they are discriminated against, and they are beginning to realize it as well. So I think that if we just listen to what's going on and try to take steps to correct the problems that we face, then we'll be much better off as a nation. But it takes a lot of political courage to admit we've made some mistakes and now let's correct them. But America has always had the right and the ability, maybe it takes too long, to say, okay, we made a mistake, let's correct it. We've done that a lot of times. I believe we'll do it again.
Let's give him a hand. Jimmy Carter, thank you.